the CIA been sort of straining at the leash to get the authorities to go after al-Qaeda and bin Laden, hadn't got them from the Clinton administration or the Bush administration. That all changed on 9/11. And then Kofor Black, who was the head of the Counterterrorism Center, basically, briefed Bush in the Situation Room, like, we have a plan. And Bush went for it.
An excerpt from today's guest, whose recent book recounts America's first secret mission into Afghanistan just days after 9/11. Award-winning journalist and author Toby Harnden is here, and I'll speak with him right after this break. I'm Robert Child, and this is Port in the Spear. May 30th is Memorial Day in the United States, a day in which America honors her warriors, and my book, Immortal Valor, is out now. The book chronicles these immortal heroes' life journeys through all the pain and struggle until their ultimate triumphs. I hope you check out the book, available in stores and online, to discover more as we honor America's warriors this Memorial Day. Welcome back. Today's guest is a recipient of the Orwell Prize for Books and a former foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times of London and the Daily Telegraph, reporting for more than 30 countries. He specializes in terrorism and war, and his recent book is called First Casualty, the Untold Story of the CIA Mission to Avenge 9/11. And journalist and author Toby Harnden joins us now. Toby, welcome to the show.
Hi, Robert. Very glad to be here.
We're thrilled because I'm just getting into this book, and it really reads like a novel. And I'm amazed at the access you were able to get. How did you get that access? Was it your journalist contacts?
So kind of just the old-fashioned way, really. I mean, I didn't have a particular in. Well, I didn't have any in with the CIA, in fact. But I was fascinated by this story, really going back to 9/11 and learning about the death of Mike Spann. And I remember watching Shannon Spann's eulogy to her husband. She was also a CIA officer. Live on CNN. So I'd always been fascinated, and that fascination grew later on when I saw a video of David Tyson, who was a CIA case officer that was with Mike Spann, running through this fort, Kalajangi, just after Mike had been killed, and David killed a lot of al-Qaeda, prisoners who were, engaged in this insurrection. And it was just incredible footage. And I remember his sort of staring eyes, the sort of 1,000-yard stare, classic, and wondering, like, who was this guy and what had he been through? And he was dressed in this mixture of Afghan garb and American gear. And so I just sort of tracked him down. I mean, I eventually found, he'd been an academic at Indiana University, and a professor there had thanked him in some acknowledgement. So I emailed the professor, who passed on my email to David, who eventually contacted me. I met him in a Panera Bread, and he couldn't say very much because he was still serving in the CIA. But we kind of kept in contact. But that was actually 2013. I mean, he dropped off, and then he came back, and then he retired. But I just went from one person to the next, just saying, this is who I am. I had a couple of books previously, which are nice calling cards I could send them to say, I wrote this Bandit Country about the IRA. I wrote Dead Men Risen about the British in Helmand in 2009. And so I just built up the credibility like that. And, I don't know who said, most of life is showing up, but I think I'm sure you've experienced this as well. You contact people and you say, listen, this is who I am. I'd love to hear your story. Right. You just sort of do it like that. And eventually there was kind of a critical mass. I felt that all these people have their own networks, and they're obviously talking about this sort of weird guy with a British accent, who's contacting them. And I guess they decided, well, he seems legit. He seems, like a straight shooter, and it seems like he's going to be fair, and he's also kind of done his homework. So yeah, I think we'll sort of talk to him. And then in the end, I contacted the agency with some trepidation, because I thought maybe there's a competing project, or they just obviously they have their reputation, but they were actually helpful. I mean, they didn't hand over stuff to me, but they did facilitate some interviews, and they did sort of get behind the project to a degree. So that was very gratifying.
I bet they can't endorse any books.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Now, the CIA, many people don't know this, they were America's first warriors on the battlefront in Afghanistan. How did that come about? Was it out of urgency, necessity?
I think both those things. So, yeah, absolutely. Immediately after 9/11, I mean, I remember it vividly. I was in Washington, D.C. that day. There was this sort of national kind of imperative to get in there. And certainly that was the way that President Bush was treating it. And, we were all fearful of the next attack coming. And, and also there was this, I think understandable and legitimate sort of desire for vengeance, to hit back at the people who killed, 3,000 at the Pentagon in New York and in Pennsylvania. And remarkably, the Pentagon didn't have a plan for Afghanistan. So General Tommy Franks was, in command of CENTCOM. He didn't have anything sort of on the shelf. And so what he was proposing was, it would take sort of months, and it would be a conventional invasion. And there was just this sort of sense, I think, politically, but also just in terms of the nation, that we just couldn't wait that long. But the CIA had been in Afghanistan, in the 1980s, sort of funding and facilitating the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets, so sort of proxy war. Soviets left in 89, and most US policymakers sort of turned their back on Afghanistan, but a small number of people in the CIA sort of kept in contact. And then you had the rise of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and eventually bin Laden relocating to Afghanistan, given safe haven by the Taliban regime, from Sudan. And so then, there was a lot of focus on Afghanistan from the agency. And then from 99 onwards, so 2 years before 9/11, there were CIA teams that were going into the Panjshir Valley to meet with Ahmed Shah Massoud, who turned out was eventually assassinated 2 days before 9/11. And David Tyson, actually, who in some ways is the central figure of the book, he was on those missions. Rich Blee was another sort of well-known CIA officer who was part of that. He headed up Alex Station, the bin Laden unit. So these teams would be going in and out, and the CIA had developed a concept of, supporting the Northern Alliance, the indigenous resistance to the Taliban, who were harboring Al-Qaeda, as a way of getting at bin Laden. And in fact, the CIA had been sort of straining at the leash to get the authorities to go after Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, hadn't got them from the Clinton administration or the Bush administration. That all changed on 9/11. And then Kofor Black, who was the head of the Counterterrorism Center, basically, briefed Bush in the Situation Room, like, we have a plan. And Bush went for it.
Now, they had some early successes on the ground, the CIA, before the troops arrived. And they learned some lessons that, according to your book, weren't followed subsequently when the troops started fanning out and getting involved with conventional warfare. What were some of the lessons the CIA learned that the troops didn't follow?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, obviously hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I don't want to be sitting here in Northern Virginia in 2021 saying, oh, if only they'd done what I said. And,
Sure.
None of this was easy. But I think what that early period showed, and so we're talking about, so Jawbreaker, the first CIA team went into the Panjshir Valley September 26th, 2001. So, 2 weeks or so after 9/11. Team Alpha were the first agency team, first Americans behind enemy lines. They were in country on October the 17th, 2001. So they got in very quickly, and very small numbers of Americans. So you had 8 CIA officers on Team Alpha, and then they brought in an ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha, 12 Green Berets 3 days later. And you had other similar teams coming in subsequently around Afghanistan. But really you had hundreds of Americans who were acting as advisors to the indigenous resistance against the foreign invaders who were the Arabs of Al-Qaeda. And that was the sort of model which went right back to sort of OSS days, OSS being predecessor of the CIA, but also the Green Berets. And and that sort of formula worked. It was an Afghan fight. The Americans, waited in the wings, didn't do much of the fighting. They sort of facilitated. The agency was able to sort of do this through sort of cultural expertise, languages, work the tribes. They brought in a lot of money. The Team Alpha brought in $3 million in non-sequential $100 bills, which helped sort of grease the wheels and sure, encourage defections and get warlords on the side. And it's sort of tragic, really. But the success in those early days was unexpected. Rumsfeld and the Pentagon were saying, well, we're going to get bogged down. There was a DIA report said that you're going to have to dig in for the winter. But in fact, Mazar-e Sharif fell November the 10th, 2001, and then by early December that was the end of the Taliban regime. Or, that Taliban regime. Obviously, they came back later on. But I think in success, the US policymakers sort of failed to look at the lessons of that period, like that it was small numbers of Americans, and it wasn't sort of the big army and bases and the 10th Mountain Division and all the supply lines. And we sort of turned from being the advisors to the resistance to being the invaders ourselves, which inevitably that's what we became when you have foreign troops with large bases patrolling, and obviously you get civilian casualties in any type of combat situation. And so we had a fairly minimalist sort of solution that worked. It wasn't perfect, and Afghanistan is messy, but instead of sticking to that, it was like and I very vividly remember the atmosphere. It's like we shoot for the moon. America can do anything. Let's go. Regime change is pretty simple. Everybody wants democracy. Let's try and build a centralized democracy in Afghanistan. Let's go and change a regime in Iraq. And now it looks like arrogance or hubris. More benignly, you could just say it's the American can-do spirit. But unfortunately, I feel that we didn't look at the model. Instead of taking the model that had been successful, we just decided to expand it and shoot for the moon.
I hope you're enjoying this episode's focus on the war on terror. Be sure to check out my earlier conversation with former Army Ranger Dr. Tony Brooks, author of Leave No Man Behind, the untold story of the Rangers' unrelenting search for Marcus Luttrell.
Just less than 24 hours before we were on that helicopter, we knew we lost a helicopter that was carrying 16 men. So we were expecting the worst, and we were angry. Who dare attack us? That was our thought. And this time it was really close to home in the special operations community. We were pretty pissed off. We were ready to fight.
You'll find the show and our past episode listings on your podcast app. May 30th is Memorial Day in the United States, a day in which America honors her warriors, and my book, Immortal Valor, is out now. The book chronicles these immortal heroes' life journeys through all the pain and struggle until their ultimate triumphs. I hope you check out the book, available in stores and online, to discover more as we honor America's warriors this Memorial Day. Now back to the conversation. Now, the title of the book is First Casualty, and obviously that refers to Mike Spann. For people that don't know who he was, could you give us some background on Michael?
Sure. So Johnny Michael Spann was his given name. The Michael spelt E-A, so the Irish way. He was 32 years old. He'd been a Marine Corps officer in the Anglico, so Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. He had joined the CIA just 2 years earlier as a paramilitary officer, and he'd met Shannon Spann, who had become his wife in June 2001 at the farm. They'd been on the same course. He had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, and Shannon and Mike had a son, Jake, who was 3 months old on 9/11.
Oh, wow.
And, I actually spent time with Shannon and some of the Team Alpha members this week. And, her life obviously was sort of turned upside down. but we were talking about Mike naturally, and I feel that Mike was sort of in a way, the personification of America after 9/11. I mean, I think he was that way before 9/11, but sort of black and white, take the fight to the enemy. He wasn't a person of sort of ambiguity or maybe nuance. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to be at the tip of the spear. He wanted to get in there. He had every reason to sit this one out. He just newly married, young baby,
sure,
complicated domestic situation because his ex-wife was terminally ill from cancer, who actually died a month after he did at the end of 2001. So, very complicated situation. But Mike's view, and, I think this extended to the rest of the team, but he was the one who kind of expressed it most strongly, was that he needed to get out there. And I mean, I was talking to Shannon about this. He had a discussion with his daughter Alison, who was sort of said, she was like 9 years old, saying, like, "Daddy, do you have to go?" And he said, "I have to go because what if every daddy said they didn't want to go? Who would protect us?" So he sort of saw protecting his family and protecting his country as sort of the same thing. And so he was the type of person who I mean, he sort of fought to get on the team. I mean, he really wanted to get out there, and that's what he did. And Shannon, I mean, it was very poignant in the eulogy that I mentioned before. Shannon said that when Mike died, he was in the right place at the right time. And by that, I mean, I asked her about it this week, and she said that what she meant was that, this was his career, this was his life, this was who he was, and he wouldn't have wanted to be, anywhere else. And, and I guess, by implication, he would have had, he died doing what he wanted to do, and would have felt it was an honorable death. And I thought that was a very sort of poignant thing for a widow to say.
Yeah, I agree. Getting to know the family and also being so close to the story about the Afghan war for 20 plus years, what were your thoughts when you saw the way this country withdrew from that war?
Oh, there were many thoughts and emotions. I mean, I was there in November 2020. And in fact, I was there when the US election happened. I watched it on Indian TV in a hotel in Kabul, which was probably the best way to watch a presidential election. But I went to the north and I interviewed Abdul Rashid Dostum, the notorious Uzbek warlord who was Team Alpha's sort of ally, America's ally in 2001. I went to Kalajangi, the fort where Mike Spann was killed and where the battle raged. But I was really struck. I mean, I came back from that trip thinking like it's over. I mean, we knew that both Biden and Trump, whoever had won, and by that point, Biden had won, had pledged to withdraw the troops and end the war from America's perspective. But I felt it was, I didn't see an American troop in the 6 weeks that I was in the country. Dostum, even in the north, was basically surrounded in his sort of stronghold of Sheberghan, which was, Uzbek Turkmen area, not a Pashtun area at all. But it took me nearly 2 weeks to get a helicopter to get out of there because the roads were unsafe. And so it felt like, the writing was on the wall. But when it happened, I didn't expect it to happen as quickly as it did. And it was heartbreaking. We'd gone from this success in a few weeks to this sort of 20-year unraveling. And, there were many Afghans I knew, the translator I'd worked with, that we actually managed to get out eventually. And he's now in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, but he lived in my basement for a few weeks. And I mean, the range of emotions from the Team Alpha members, from, sort of despair, mourning, anger, all those things. And, clearly there were a lot of questions they had about the manner of the withdrawal. And from some of them, the fact of the withdrawal, there was this feeling that we could have kept in at least a small number of troops. But it was very impressive to see what happened with them. And it was sort of characteristic that they sort of just pivoted and started helping getting people out. And so that they channeled their energies and emotions and everything into doing that. And to this day, I mean, Shannon Spann is, desperately, every day is working on getting Afghans out. She was in Portugal trying to facilitate flights out recently.
Wow.
David Tyson as well. And so that's what they're doing. And that's how they're trying to, pay back the allies that helped them, 20 years ago, and try and get some good out of this, pretty painful situation.
Well, I'm glad they're doing that. The book is called First Casualty. Toby, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been great.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Robert. I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. Next time, author Mark Hager will be here to discuss his new book, The Last of the 357th Infantry, Harold Frank's World War II story of faith and courage.
Running out of ammo, one of the men that was with him got hit in the leg, and the leg was broken from the round that hit his leg, and he's trying to carry him, get across a flooded field, which he thought may get him back to the American lines. And when he pulls him up and crawls up on the bank with him, there was a German from the 15th Parachute Infantry Regiment with his MP40 standing right there greeting them. He looked around and summed it up really well. He says, "We're about to find out what tough really is."
That's next time. And be sure to check out our Point of the Spear YouTube channel with bonus video material plus full military history documentaries. There's tons to explore, and I hope you check it out. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.